The Director's report of activities in 2020, here is a separate report reviewing some key data since the last AGM. I should explain that our financials are audited every year and are available on our website. The 2020 financials will be available by mid-year. But meantime, here are a few data highlights. First of all, some data from the projects, and the key insight into these data is that they are unpredictable. If you look back at our feeding program over the last 4 years, you see that the numbers haven't varied that much from month to month in terms of the cold meal served, that's usually breakfast, and the hot meal served. 2020, and you see massive variances depending on whether or not we had people staying in the building and whether or not we could serve food on the streets, both outside our building and also in other parts of the city. Managing this unpredictability has become a key part of our challenge. Similarly with the clinic, we've had to cope with all kinds of changes through the year. And so overall, the number of patients that we saw is markedly lower than in previous years, both the number of patients seen at the clinic in the DHC itself, the number of HIV tests, and the number of community consultations. But that drop for the total of 2020, the variability within the year. Again, as a function of different lockdown levels, we saw changes in what we could do and where we could do it, how many people were on the streets, how many people in our building, how many people we could visit in the emergency shelters, and how many other patients, refugees and poor people in central Durban were able to access the clinic in our building. The latest figures for January show that the numbers are going back up again. Let me take this opportunity also to report back on the general COVID appeal that we hosted on behalf of a group of NGOs. This was as a result of a decision taken by the Homeless Task Team at the beginning of the hard lockdown at the end of March, that it would help if people had a single reference point if they wanted to donate. And it was agreed by all involved that the Dennis Hurley Centre should play that role, asking people to put money in our bank account, but using the reference COVID so that we could track the donations. It was felt that doing this provided a credibility in making sure the fund was separate from any government involvement and was being administered by a trusted organisation, as well as the possibility of giving tax certificates to those who required them. All the COVID-marked donations in our system were ring-fenced, and we double-checked if there was ever any ambiguity about the intention of the donor. Overall, there was a fantastic response from all parts of the Durban community. This chart shows the total of the over 1.8 million that was raised. A large amount of it from anonymous donors, but you'll see from individuals, corporates, and local trusts. In fact, over 650 separate donations were made, most of them small amounts. Only about 30 were over 10,000 rand. We then had to work out a system for distributing this money, because legally the Dennis Hurley Centre trustees were accountable for making sure the money was identified, allocated fairly, and that we could report back to stakeholders. Because we as an organisation might benefit from the appeal, we were keen to make sure that we were not part of the group that assessed the applications. And so a group was set up which comprised members of different religious communities and different NGOs who did not have a stake in the applications being made. As a result of their hard work, and we're very grateful for all that they did, the money was allocated in this way. 200,000 of it was already pre-allocated by the donors to drug support. An additional amount went to Sanpud, which has been continuing the drug support program, so you see about a third of the money, marked in blue, has gone for drug support. The Dennis Hurley Centre itself received about 13% for the healthcare work that we did during lockdown, and also the program to replace IDs. Over half the money, marked in green, went to different organisations who were involved in feeding programmes, both in managing the feeding programme, led by We Are Durban, and a host of large and small organisations that were providing food. It should be noted there were other feeding programmes who did not apply to the fund and sourced other means of funding the programmes they did. We're very grateful to all of the organisations that we worked with and very grateful to the donors who made this possible. Let me now report back on our own financials. Starting with cost management. It's something that we are very keen to keep a handle on, very keen to make sure that our costs do not get out of control, as can often happen with NGOs. If you look at our costs over time, going back to 2016, you see that they increased in the first few years as we increased the range of services, but then after that have stabilized, and even with the extraordinary costs that we incurred during COVID, they've remained pretty much under control. And our budget for 2021 holds us steady going forwards. Explain a little bit about those extraordinary costs. About 275,000 in 2020 was not budgeted for because these were costs that were unexpected because of the pandemic. That covered personal protective equipment, salary payments, some of which we're hoping to be reimbursed either by TERS or by the municipality, the substantial spend that we've made on distributing food, not in plastic containers, but in eco-friendly containers so that we protect people and also protect the planet, but that's been costing us R1,000 a day. And then bridging payments to enable sick, elderly and disabled residents to move into permanent shelters. Most should get grants to fund that going forwards, but the system of obtaining IDs and obtaining grants has been so slow that we've provided bridging funding. What's interesting to see when you look at our costs is if you take our 2018 expenditure and roll it forwards by inflation, the dotted line, you'll see that our costs, even with the extraordinary expenses in 2020, remain lower in real terms than they were in 2018. A real tribute to the cost management by the different managers at the Dennis Hurley Centre in making sure the costs do not go out of control. And specifically, where did we spend the money? Well, 60% of it in 2020 was spent on staffing, as you would expect, although even then that's only 2.6 million rand for 19 full-time equivalent staff. And the rest spread, as you would expect, across a variety of all the costs involved in running the kind of projects we do and the kind of building that we run. What's interesting is if you track those different areas of spend over time, the relative percentage change doesn't really vary that much. And now finally a report back on our income and our income plans for the future. Well, I showed you where we spent our money. Where did we source our money? You'll see, as always, a wide variety of sources of money for the Dennis Hurley Centre, and this is something that we're very proud of because it means that we're not overly reliant on any one source. Inevitably, we saw some sources really suffering. Faith organisations in Emmanuel Cathedral were able to contribute less because, of course, churches were closed for a large part of the year. Venue hire was less than we would expect because we couldn't host the organisations that we often host in the building as a source of income. But we did have substantial contributions from overseas individuals, less from overseas organisations this year because some of the funding that we had, for example, from the US government, ended in 2019 or early in 2020. There's one section there which is blank for the moment. I'll come back to that. Let me talk a little bit about the section marked value of government medicines, about 3% of our needs. I should stress that we get no cash funding at all from any part of South African government, national, provincial or municipal. While that is problematic, on the other hand, it means that we are independent and can stand out and speak out against some of the human rights abuses which are perpetrated by parts of government against homeless people and against refugees. But we are very grateful for the collaboration we get, particularly from City Health, in terms of donations of medicines. The value of these has been unpredictable since it started in 2017. As you see, it's gone up and it's gone down, it's gone up again, but it still is a substantial contribution, about 60% of our medicine needs in 2020. We did benefit from some COVID-related TERS payments for staff, although we're expecting an additional amount to come in for that. Our building was, of course, used as a residential centre, and eThekwini had promised that they would pay us for the use of the building. We have received no money at all for that use. Interesting to note that the eThekwini, meantime, was spending 12,000 rand per day to hire each marquee that they used in the emergency shelters. They clearly don't value our building as much as they value a tent. We were specifically promised money for providing staffing for the emergency shelters, in fact the equivalent of $165,000 for the staffing at the Dennis Hurley Centre and the Jewish Club, but we've received no money for that and no reply to our inquiries. That's shocking for us. What's even more shocking is the failure of the government's COVID grant to help the homeless. Clearly all the homeless are likely to be entitled to this, but from our best estimates, about 80% of homeless people have failed to access that grant, a very small amount of 350 Rand per month. So let me explain that other piece in our sources of money, the sustainability appeal. And that was a third of the money that we raised in 2020. This was a request we made specifically to some of our long-standing donors, individuals and organizations, both in South Africa and overseas, recognizing that fundraising will be harder going forwards, and so specifically asking them to donate funds that we could use to ensure that we remain sustainable going forwards. The response from these donors was phenomenal, quite extraordinary how generous they were in recognizing our need for funds and recognizing our need to shore up our activities going forwards. Let me explain how we'll be using that. If you look at our income over time, you'll see from 2017 to 2019, it's actually been dropping while expenses have increased. But we've been able to cover that because of funds rolled over from one year to the next. However, by the end of 2019, there were not funds to roll over, and we were very anxious about covering our expenses in 2020. In the end, the income raised in 2020 was more than our expenses, and we have been able to cover that with an amount to roll over to 2021. In addition to that, the sustainability appeal added greatly to our income raised in 2020, though not to be spent in 2020. So if we imagine our expenses going forwards, our budget for 2021 and the forecast expenses for 22 and 23, and see that increasing at about 5% a year, our plan is to take the sustainability appeal money and spread it over those 3 years, 50% allocated to 2021 and 25% each for 22 and 23. That we need to raise money in those years, but the amount to be raised is a lot less. And we feel that's appropriate given the economic pressures on South Africa and our overseas donors for the next few years. It means it takes some of the pressure off. We're a little bit less anxious about fundraising for the next few years. That doesn't mean that we don't need money, but we need just a bit less. So let me end by saying a big thank you, not just to our donors, but to the people who make sure that our data are clear and transparent. Our Treasurer, Sipho Pakati, his fellow trustees, and our administration and finance team, Errol Victor and Leanne Banks, without whom the quality of data that you see and the quality of reports that we produce would not be possible. Thank you very much.